understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
Hey, welcome to the podcast. It's John here. Today we have a really special episode, which is a conversation recorded recently at the Dalkey Book Festival with none other than Christiane Amanpour. Now, you probably know Christiane as the CNN chief correspondent and anchor of the multi-award-winning flagship global affairs programme, Amanpour. Now, this conversation is wide-ranging to say the least. They cover everything from Christiane's early career to what it was like to be a war journalist in the first Gulf War and in the Bosnian War in the 90s. They also discuss the conflict in the Middle East, along with the changing phases of politics in Europe and America, with a look to the future. So I'm going to stop talking now and hand you over to Mac and Christiane.
Welcome to the church.
I love this church, it's beautiful.
Welcome to the altar. Christiane, let's start at the beginning. I, of course, saw you probably the first time in the Bosnian War was when I came across your reporting, but explain to me your background, how you got into journalism in the first place, and then we'll kick off.
So my background is that I'm half Iranian, half English, and in 1979 there was a revolution in my country, and essentially it was the Islamic Revolution, and basically I had to leave.
Very quickly.
I wasn't really going to be spending my time in a scarf and, you know, women being second-class citizens and this and that. And it was time for me to go to college anyway. So my father said, you need to leave now. And it was just before the Ayatollah Khomeini came back. So I went to London, then I went to the United States, and I wanted to study journalism. And weirdly, I had seen on the television growing up, even in Iran, American TV shows, some American news shows, people like Barbara Walters and others, news people, whose fame, because she actually interviewed the Shah of Iran, even came over, you know, she was famous there as well. And so I got to start thinking about journalism, about what I wanted to do now that I couldn't rely on whatever I might have done as a person staying in Iran at that particular time. Couldn't rely on my parents, couldn't rely on the sort of, you know, the system that I'd grown up in anymore. And I thought journalism would be a good idea because I was old enough to be in Iran in the year leading up to the revolution. And I saw it all happen. I saw it all unfold. And I was actually, as well as being personally affected, very, very interested. And I thought, this is the kind of thing that I want to do, to tell these kinds of stories to the world. And then I decided between print and broadcast, and because the people who I would watch telling these stories were mostly on television, I decided that I would like to do that. So I went to university and in Rhode Island in the United States. And then, long story short, I didn't fit the US model, you know, to become an on-air personality where you had to start at the very bottom. You know, at that time in 1983, any woman on television in the United States was mostly blonde, blue-eyed, had a Midwestern accent, and was able to start in very small markets and then hopefully progress. Anyway, couldn't do that. So I was at this station as an intern in Providence, and they said, wow, we've just heard about this new thing called CNN that this guy Ted Turner has created. And we've heard some English accents on it. And there were a couple of Anglos on there. And they said, you should go. So I went. I basically called them up. And, you know, they were at that time it was called Chicken Noodle News, which meant that it was really very, very small, you know, operation trying to make its way in the media sort of firmament. And they gave me an interview over the phone, 10 questions, one of which was, what's the capital of Iran? So I kind of aced it. And I went down to Atlanta, Georgia, which is, to me, you know, I mean, it was just, I'd never been down south, and, you know, I mean, I just didn't know anything or what I was going to expect. And they put me in the department which was more technical, because that's what I was doing in Rhode Island. And then they said, when I arrived, the chief recruiter said, hey, you're foreign. we got a space on the foreign desk that needs filling. So then I started on the foreign desk, the foreign news coverage desk, as a lowest person on the ladder, and essentially worked my way up.
So you started as a reporter on the foreign desk?
Lowest. I was bringing tea and coffee to the foreign editor.
To the blonde-haired, blue-eyed.
She was actually blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and large, and she liked her Twinkies and her chocolates and her. So I was always being sent to the break room to get stuff for her.
No, but obviously, I mean, being Iranian, having this sort of cosmopolitan backdrop, the foreign, and particularly for Americans who don't get out so much.
Yeah.
The foreign, the foreign desk was yours. I mean, you must have brought something that they were like, wow, this girl.
I mean, I'd like to have thought
things.
that, but in fact, this woman whose flunky I was, essentially, actually did not invest in my future at all.
Surprise, surprise.
And in fact, she would say things to make me cry every day, especially when the big bosses were coming around to do sort of final checkup, let's say 5, 6 at night, the president, sometimes the vice president, and I would have my back to the newsroom because my job was also to telex a lot of CNN affiliates as to what video and reports they could use and couldn't use in their broadcast. And as I was turning my back to, and frantically bashing out these telexes, she would say, oh, she thinks she's going to be a foreign correspondent, ha, ha, ha. And I'm like crying, and I won't turn around and let them see me crying, but I'm definitely crying.
Yeah.
So I decided that I had to get out of under her thumb. So I did everything that I could, including coming in on my own time on weekends, to learn how to write for the news anchors and then eventually to produce from inside without having yet gone outside, and then eventually to beg them to let me be a field producer. And then finally, I begged them to let me go to New York because Atlanta literally really was not happening. I mean, in terms of being a foreign correspondent, it wasn't going to happen in Atlanta. So I knew I needed to get to New York. And because they were pretty cheap and because I hadn't done anything yet, I mean, I was like a nobody, they weren't going to send me to New York. But there was a guy who wanted to go off on a sabbatical. Yeah, leave of absence, whatever.
We always love that.
Yeah. So I went and filled his shoes. And then I never looked back. I became a producer and a correspondent. And then 3 years later, I went to be a foreign correspondent. So my first story was the first Gulf War.
The 91 Gulf War.
1991, yeah.
And tell me again, just tell me about that. I mean, it's a long time ago. It's the Saddam invading Kuwait. It's the Desert Storm. It's the Storm in Norman. You remember that?
Oh, I remember.
All those guys.
Tried to interview him.
Yeah, but what's that like when you first go into the field as a reporter?
Okay, so it was incredibly fun. It was so much fun. It was like being on a movie set that you knew eventually was going to have a moment where it was actually going to get serious. But you didn't know until the very end because they were hoping that Saddam Hussein would get scared by the buildup. And remember, the United States gathered a coalition of some 500,000 troops from all over the world, British. Did the Irish go? I don't think so. No, you're neutral, right? No, you didn't go. No, you do peacekeeping. That's why we like the Irish. Yeah. So there were the French, there were the Brits, there were all the Arabs, including Syria, by the way. And they were hoping that this would intimidate Saddam Hussein and have him basically, sue for peace and back down. But it didn't. And which reminds me a little bit of Putin now, in any event. So then it did become a war, and we reported from there, and then I went to Baghdad, and I did the last bit from Iraq. And
so you went all the way up from Kuwait?
No, I didn't, because you couldn't do that. I was on a aircraft carrier in the Red Sea, JFK, what do you call it? The USS JFK. And then I had to leave the area and then take a plane to Jordan and then drive into Baghdad from there. So I saw the end of that war from Baghdad. Mm-hmm.
And that was when they stopped.
Yes, they.
It was like, I mean, was that
they had to stop.
Was that an unusual, like, for yourselves as reporters? Was there a sense that, okay, the Iraq? I didn't realize we'd go to start here, but the Iraqi army is on the run. there's going to be regime change, and there wasn't.
No, there wasn't regime change. But interestingly, just before I got there, you know, this was very, very unusual to have. And CNN, the thing about the Iraq War, essentially cemented CNN on the international agenda because it was the first time there was this incredible satellite television live product. And you could see it 24/7. And even in Iraq, where Saddam Hussein, I mean, there's a dictatorship, right? The Saudis allowed the US to have their satellites, even though they're also not exactly Democrats, but they had the Americans there protecting them. So they had to allow American media to follow the kind of rules that they generally follow. But when we got to Iraq, the Iraqis did not allow this round-the-clock TV. But CNN had this bit of technology that was called a 4-wire. And essentially, it's a box with a microphone, and it's connected to the satellite, and then you speak out of it, and you can broadcast. So the Iraqis didn't know we had it. And or at least they didn't know what it was. If they knew it was there, they didn't know what it was or what its capabilities. So that's why CNN had a lock on the first day of the Gulf War, because nobody else was able to broadcast, because all their technology had been either confiscated or closed down, and they'd all been thrown out.
So that's why CNN emerged at that stage.
Correct. And on top of everything else, a lot of other news organizations decided to pull their people out of Iraq because, for heaven's sake, they knew what was facing them from, you know, the cruise missiles, the aircraft, all of that. And the Pentagon scared the bejesus out of them. They didn't want us being there. So everybody pulled out, especially if they couldn't work, if their technology had been closed down. But Ted Turner, our incredible founder, said to the president of CNN, we will remain in Iraq, but only those who want to stay will stay, those who want to leave can leave, and we won't hold it against them. And so that's what happened.
And you stuck your hand up and said, I'm sticking around.
Well, I came in almost like a second wave, because I did the first part of the war from Saudi Arabia, from the so-called Allied side, and the second part from mid-February to the end of February, early March, when it ended, from Baghdad. So I saw it from both sides.
And then I remember
we had a cruise missile, just so you understand, in the Al Rashid Hotel. And the Al Rashid Hotel, where the press was, had does it sound familiar? A tunnel system, under which Saddam and his people would move, you know, not necessarily during the war, but in general. That was their sort of way of getting around without showing themselves to the public. And so the Allies, you know, the Pentagon wanted to smash our hotel, but they didn't. But there was one night when a cruise missile, fragments of it, I mean, they like to say it wasn't directed at us, but I don't know.
But it was.
But no, it was there.
They don't usually miss these things. I mean,
Anyway, it didn't bring down the hotel, that's all I can tell you.
And then you know, when I remember you've been very much front and center in the Bosnian war.
Yes.
So this is, again, we're talking, you know, again, a decade later, you find yourself in former Yugoslavia.
Yep. Not a decade later. It was like 2 years later, because after the Gulf War, the Soviet Union had collapsed and communism was collapsing, and Yugoslavia started to collapse, and Slobodan Milosevic wanted to keep it together. So I went to Croatia and then to Bosnia for those wars, and so I spent all of the 90s there, and basically it was a project whereby this guy Milosevic wanted to create a white Christian supremacist Greater Serbia. And so he did launch a program of ethnic cleansing which turned into genocide and have been adjudicated in The Hague at the International Criminal Tribunal as such. And we witnessed it. And we were in Sarajevo and the other towns, but mostly Sarajevo, which is where the civilians were. But it was really there in Bosnia that I learned what it meant to be a journalist under these kinds of extreme conditions. That this wasn't covering the local town hall, this wasn't, you know, being in Washington, D.C. This was a young journalist. I'm speaking for myself now. This is only my second war, and this one was absolutely a big force against civilians. It wasn't like the Gulf War, which was two big military forces facing off, which was a traditional war on a battlefield. This was a force that was armed, arrayed on the hills above, raining down artillery and tank and sniper fire on the civilians in order to kill and move the civilians, which is basically what's happening between Russia and Ukraine right now. They want to clear a whole area of civilians so that they can claim it for themselves, make a greater Russia. So I learned in Bosnia, and they use human rights, massive human rights violations like they did in Bosnia, rape as a weapon of war, killing civilians, including children, and that's what we saw. So when it happened in Ukraine, I knew exactly what we were seeing. I knew exactly because we'd seen it in Europe before.
So let's talk about Ukraine, the ebb and flow and the optimism of the Ukrainians in the first 6-8 months of the war. Then the Ukrainians had this counteroffensive, and now it seems that grinding ability of Russia it's what I think Stalin said, quantity is equality. If you have, a huge number and you have the power, how fragile do you think?
Well, first of all, Putin has made it clear that he does not care about what happens to his own people. So he's pulling people out of their bedrooms, out of their prison cells. Now women, apparently, are the latest he's trying to recruit from prisons to send to the front. He used all these militias, Prigozhin's militias, etc., the Wagner group, and he doesn't actually care. And according to the figures, the Russians are suffering many more losses than the Ukrainians because they're just throwing, like World War I, people into the meat grinder, into this, carnage. And they just literally do not care because Russia is not a democracy. Russia is not threatened at the moment by any kind of popular revolt against this or any resistance. If it is happening, it's very... it's punished.
Yes.
And so it's not able to manifest itself. Ukraine, on the other hand, has less people. It is a democracy. The government has to worry about the people, and it does. My view is that Russia, Putin, everybody kind of knows this now, did not at all anticipate that Ukraine would be able to resist. And remember, this is before Ukraine was getting any Western support. This is literally in the first few days.
Yeah.
It decided to resist. And if you go back and you look at Volodymyr Zelensky and his first speech where he came out in his now famous uniform, which was, khaki T-shirt, fatigues, etc. And he said, "I am here, we are here, we're staying."
This was the kind of the selfie that...
Yes, it was... that was more than just a little social media. That absolutely set the tone of how this war was going to be fought and resisted, and what the leadership was going to do to stay with its people, and how it also rallied its people for, to stay and fight. And so for the first, I would say so that was mid-February, late February. By the end of March, beginning of April, it was that first week of April, the Ukrainians had managed to so shock the Russians and to use Stinger missiles and all the stuff that they actually did have to get in their face and stand right by the tanks and fire at them and do everything that they could with what they had at that time to push them back. So the Kyiv operation by Moscow failed miserably. And then I can't remember how long, several months later, it was sort of August of 22, September, they also pushed them back from Kharkiv, which is now in play again. So the Ukrainians did... And they were quite funny. I don't know whether you remember, and we're in a church, so I'm not sure if I can say it. But you remember
we had David Baddiel here last night. There's nothing you can say. There's nothing, Christiane, you can say that'll come close to the sacrilege out of that fella's mouth.
This I can swear in defense of freedom and democracy.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. So those famous sailors who were on Snake Island, who when they were threatened by the Moskva, the big ship, who told them to surrender, they said, "Fuck you, Russian sailors."
Yes, I remember that.
Leave, that's basically what they said. So by the time we all arrived there, all the road signs were saying, "Fuck you, Russian soldiers." And that was not just a slogan, it was a politics, it was their power, it was their superpower. And so I remember thinking in the first week of May of 2022, they have pushed back the Russians, they've got them off, kilter, they've got them on the back foot. That was the time when the West should have poured every weapon known to man, except for, obviously not nuclear weapons, but the artillery and all that kind of stuff, Air Force, all of that. And they should have... At that time, Russia would have been defeated. It would have just gone away, wouldn't have been able to cope. But they waited and they waited and they waited and they waited. And the Russians, kept coming and they kept coming and they were able to regroup. But at that time, they could have been pushed out. So I really fault the West for not doing what they could have done, barely 6 months into the war. They could have stopped it, I believe, and they could have, without too much effort, they could have won.
And that gets us into the, when I see you night after night interviewing, let's say, American politics of the Republican side who have been faltering on Ukraine, have been stalling on aid, etc. Where do you think that comes from? Because in the old days, the Republican, we started with George Herbert Bush, a very much old-style Republican, would have had a totally different worldview. Let's talk about the way in which the right in America, the republics in America, have changed.
Mm-hmm. Even before him, there was Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan was considered a crazy guy. Many of the leftists in the world thought that he was going to start a nuclear war. But what Ronald Reagan actually did do was remember 40 years ago, he went to Pointe du Hoc. I've just come from the D-Day commemoration, the 80th. And I reread the famous speech that he made, on the top of the big hill, Pointe du Hoc, paying tribute to the American Rangers who climbed up in the face of this, Nazi gun nest, and they were being killed, and they kept coming, and they kept coming, and they took that gun nest, and they, it was their first big liberation. So the point of that is he made a speech in which he praised them, but also said to the Soviet Union, because it was 84, so it was still the Cold War. So he said, the Soviet Union, they helped, they did their part in liberating parts of Europe, but they stayed. And he used the words uninvited, unwanted, and unyielding. Then he also said, but what we want to tell the Soviet Union is that we don't want war. And when we see and when we look for hopefully somebody who will come towards us to make peace, we will grab that hand. Well, sure enough, a few years later, somebody did come forth. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev. And Reagan had the sense and the presence of mind to grab that hand, and together, not one or the other, together, they ended communism. And the Soviet Union fell. And that was a huge, huge big deal, because it just showed what kind of Republicans, I'm getting back to your question, what kind of Republicans they were there. They were strongly anti-communist, they were about defense. Now, all these years later, the Republican Party appears, according to all the analysts who write about it and really worry about it, the current crop of Trump Republicans, the MAGA Republicans, are America Firsters. So they've gone back to the Charles Lindbergh, to all of those, that kind of party that was powerful, isolationist, not just isolationist, appeasers, people who believe they could. I mean, Trump actually does think that he and Putin can get things done. He likes a strong person. He does not want to commit American forces. Now, on the one hand, that's a good thing. He doesn't want to. He's not started a war when he was president, but he also is not to be relied on to defend American interests and American allies here in Europe, or even in the Middle East. If you remember, during his presidency, Iran sent a huge swarm of drones into what was called the Abqaiq oil facility. And the Saudis were expecting it to be like George W. Bush time and get some help, please.
The USS JFK.
Right, and Trump no, you're on your own. So that's who these Republicans are right now. And it's quite dangerous, frankly.
So let's go back to Ukraine. What happens if Putin wins?
Well, that's why this is important to have this conversation, because it's not abstract.
No, it's not abstract.
In my opinion, and I think I'm right, in my opinion, it's the biggest threat that we've had to Europe and to our way of life since World War II. After World War II, after defeating a totalitarian dictatorship with terrible intent, and what they did, the Nazis obviously, 6 million Jews, the Holocaust, the Americans basically created the post-World War order, which we've all been living and pretty much benefiting from, economically, politically, in terms of human rights, sovereignty, rules of the world, rules of the road, etc. And the biggest rule of the road is that you cannot change a border by force. That's the biggest thing. And human rights, etc., democracy, freedom. All of that is in play again right now because of Putin. And it's not an exaggeration. And people say, oh, Putin, don't be silly. He'll be happy with just a little bit of, Ukraine. No, he won't. He wasn't happy with Georgia and whatever else he invaded in 2008. He hasn't been happy with anything since the fall of the Soviet Union, and he's an old-style KGB guy who believes strongly in the projection of force, who believes in reconstituting imperial Russia, not necessarily the Soviet Union, but imperial Russia. And he believes that. He said it himself. The fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. And then he's decided, and he was disappointed by George W. Bush after essentially granting Russian airspace and all the rest of it for the attack on Afghanistan to try to get rid of al-Qaeda after 9/11. He was then pissed off with the Americans for them expanding the war to Iraq. And then he was further pissed off when he allowed the Obama administration and that group of Western leaders to rescue Libyans who might have been at real risk from Muammar Gaddafi, but he didn't intend them to go that far. So he believes that the West is out to get him. He's wrong about NATO, just so that we all understand. It's got nothing to do with NATO at all. NATO was never going to go into Russia. It's countries themselves who who saw what the Soviet Union did to them during, the Cold War. They wanted freedom. They wanted to get out of the Warsaw Pact. It's not about NATO because his first crackdown in Ukraine was about the EU. In 2013 and 2014, he rejected Ukraine trying to not join the EU, but have it's called a partnership agreement. And then he annexed, Crimea. And the Russians who I speak to, the people who were in close contact with him, say that in terms of dealing with Putin, all he understands is force. So no amount of trying to appease him or trying to give him a little here or a little there is going to do the job. He just came out and he offered yet another peace proposal to Ukraine. It involved even more demands than he made before, even more annexations of parts of Ukraine that he hasn't even got anywhere close to. I mean, that's Putin. And so we will all be in danger because that will bring that front closer and it will bring the threat of the collapse of democracy closer at a time where you can see in Europe, in the United States, democracy and freedom are very, very much at risk from within.
From within. I mean, this is the thing. So what we're thinking about now is what you're saying is that Europe, France, Germany in particular, need to take very serious a territorial, I wouldn't say existential because that's thrown around too often, but a territorial threat to their eastern side. And yet, if we look at the latest election, particularly in the case of France, you have somebody who's very ambivalent toward Putin, Marine Le Pen. Sometimes she's a friend, sometimes she's not, but she's not necessarily somebody who is going to say, okay, he's my enemy.
I mean, that's true. And by the way, it's not just the eastern side. The Poles are incredibly worried. They're the western side of NATO, of the Ukraine. The Baltics are really, really worried. They think they'll be the first.
So they're really worried.
They're very, very worried. Now, Marine Le Pen, who famously Putin bailed her out when she needed money.
Yeah, there was actually a loan from a Russian bank, wasn't there?
Yeah. And she's run off to Putin every time she needs, photo op. The truth is, she did actually verbally defend Ukraine's rights after the invasion, but her history is very, very troubling, not just her own history with Putin and other authoritarians, but her father's history. If you remember, I think he was a Waffen SS officer in occupied France. He called the Holocaust a detail in history. He's massively anti-Semitic. He was, a big shot in occupied France during the war. And she has tried to, I'm just going to use the word whitewash that and make herself electable. And now, I mean, we've come so far in the last, I covered elections in France where her father came close in the first round and everybody freaked out. And luckily, there was a second round and then they lost, the National Front lost in the second round. But now you have AfD, you have in Germany, you have her, you have a far-right prime minister in Italy who says all the right things on the international stage, but is very, very conservative at home, using all the conservative and right-wing political vehicles. So what is it? It's immigration, it's culture wars, so it's LGBTQ, transgender, abortion, all of that kind of stuff. And the big overarching picture is what Putin has said and what other of these far-right leaders have said. We are white Christian nations, mostly male-dominated. And that's how we want to keep it. So if you don't want to live in a country where they have equal rights for gay people, or the whole spectrum, we're your people. If you don't want to live in a country where there's not a single immigrant, we're your people. It flies in the face of every reality and every economic and social and human rights norm. But as we've seen, it is really, really easy to fire people up with scaremongering. Scaremongering is the easiest thing in the whole wide world.
Yes.
And it succeeds at the ballot box.
And it succeeds.
Yeah.
Just when we look at the Americans talking about the legitimacy of borders and human rights and all that stuff, it brings us to the Middle East. And most Europeans, if there is a European street, okay, so most Europeans, I would say, look at Gaza, look at Israel, look at America's pretty much unambiguous support of Israel over the last 60-odd years, and say, I buy you in Ukraine, I buy what you're selling here, but there is an essential hypocrisy when it comes to these two places, that the rights of Ukrainians are absolutely sovereign and we respect them, but the rights of Palestinians we don't respect. And it seems to me that America runs the risk of dividing its alliance with Europe, which is its fundamental alliance, over this present Israeli government, the present Israeli strategy. And I see you every night, talking and interviewing and chatting and jousting and back and forth. How do you think this pans out?
Well, firstly, it's very hard to navigate, as you know, and this is being played out on the street everywhere, and in colleges and in conversations and in everywhere. It's very difficult to navigate. I would just say that Ukraine is also not particularly safe because of the Trump MAGA. They waited 7 months to send the aid, which gave the Russians the advantage now. But let's get back to this one. This has been going on for decades. There was a time in the 1990s, as you know, that the United States eventually came to support the Oslo Accords, which were done really by the parties themselves and by these Norwegian mediators. And it was an amazing template for how you can get warring factions together. Even at that time, Israel had this thing whereby it banned any serving officials from talking to any PLO. PLO was then still called a terrorist organization. So they got sort of track 2 and they did all this stuff. And then for various reasons, including the murder of the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin by a Jewish terrorist, it collapsed the peace process and it never ever was able to get back on track. I believe strongly, like most people, I interviewed your own Taoiseach, Simon Harris, who told me about recognizing Palestine as a state, along with Norway and Spain. I spoke to officials from all of those countries and asked them why. And they say, because we have to put on the table, finally, after all these decades of attempts to get to some kind of resolution, the fact that this is our end game. This is what we see, 2 states living side by side in peace and in security with human rights and democracy for all. That is absolutely, clearly, the only political program that's that's possible right now. And even that is losing traction because as all sides become more and more hardened, both the Israeli street, the Palestinian street, they've kind of given up. The Israelis say, what do you mean? We can't have a terrorist organization, a terrorist state living next to us. The Palestinians say, what do you mean? We've never been able to get further than the first few, steps of any kind of peace process because you just keep putting it off and you keep putting it off. I feel that we have to understand that there are two victims here. And we have to be able to somehow knock heads together with a credible. The only nation with the heavy weight to do it is the United States. Now, it is most definitely losing credibility, there's no doubt about it, with everybody, but it's still the only nation, and we can come back to your own country and Northern Ireland, etc., that can get the parties together and through its, auspices, try to do that. And unfortunately, the United States decided after the last time, I think it was around 2013, Obama had sent John Kerry to try to negotiate with the situation, and he came back having been rebuffed. And then the US they just see no evil, hear no evil. Do you know what I mean? They just left it. And to the point that Jake Sullivan, I don't know, was it several weeks before October 7th, said, the Middle East seems to be quieter than it's ever been right now, etc., blah, blah, blah. So the fact that has been demonstrated is that even with the Abraham Accords and even with the attempt to get Saudi Arabia and Israel normalized, all of that's great. But it ignored the fact that the big issue is the Palestinians. Israel's never been at war with Saudi Arabia or with the UAE or with Morocco or anybody else. It's great that they normalized, but that's not where the war is. So until they really can somehow do what many people think is impossible, which I don't think is impossible.
You don't think?
No. Why was it not impossible in Ireland? No, why?
You think it's analogous?
I do. I think it can be.
It can be.
It's not exactly analogous, but it can be. There was an armed struggle, there was a British government, there was the Republicans, there was the Unionists, all of these parties.
Yep.
The IRA with terrorists, remember in South Africa, the ANC with terrorists. The armed forces, the armed groups finally realized that military is not going to work and they have to come to the table. And they had the convening power of all the powerful to do it, to take whatever Sinn Féin and the Unionist parties, to get them together and to help them, including disarmament and all the rest of it.
And it was, in effect, the Americans nudging,
correct.
pushing,
it was Bill Clinton,
nudging.
it was Tony Blair, it was John Major, it was Clinton, it was George Mitchell.
And it's interesting, it was also the Americans stopped the Yugoslav war. At the end, it was the Americans said, okay,
but they did have
because the
come
Europeans
in,
were faffing around all over the place.
But the Americans had to come in with military power to push the Yugoslavs back, and then they brought the Dayton Peace Accords and negotiated it with the parties. But I spoke to the former head of MI6, John Soares, on my program, and he's been in foreign policy and national security policy for decades. And he said, in the end, if you look at Northern Ireland, if you look at South Africa, if you look at some of the Colombia, for instance, it has to be the strongest force that makes the first move.
The strongest force, And it's only
And that
it's only
hasn't
the
yet
strong can
happened
make the peace. I mean, that's also the thing.
Yeah, but I mean, in that case,
It's the Americans.
Well, no, in South Africa, it was F.W. de Klerk, the white apartheid president, who went and negotiated the end of his system with Mandela in prison. In Northern Ireland, the British and the Americans sort of came forward, right? And they were the stronger party. Yeah. And it's going to take the same in Israel and Gaza. I think a lot of the onus on do they believe anymore in a peace process will be on the Israelis as well.
Just project, Christiane, forward. We have a potential in 2 weeks' time in France of a totally gridlocked government. Highly likely the Labour Party is going to be in power in the UK in, again, 2 weeks' time. Come the 6th of November, our friend Mr. Trump may well be back in the game. Putin, as you said, is sitting there pushing in Kharkiv. Who knows what's going to happen there? What's your sense of the world in 2025?
So a friend of mine who's also a journalist who gave a speech the other day said, we are at the end of a period of illusions. All our illusions that democracy, the liberal economic world order, all of that will be triumphant or transcendent. I would just say that, last year I interviewed Barack Obama in Greece, and I asked him, can democracy survive? And he said, yes, but only if we fight for it. So all that to say, I believe voting matters, elections matter. People have to decide whether and what kind of a society they want to live in, and then they cannot sit on their hands. And I believe that in the United States, it's such a tiny, it's on a knife edge.
And it's a sliver of people.
It's a very small sliver of people that will decide. And I'm not prepared to make a judgment right now. I know what I would say if I had to bet right now, but I think the conviction of Trump will affect people when they're in the ballot box. Already people have said that. I think one shouldn't look at MAGA, his people. The base are his base. There is base. Everybody's base is the base, and they're not movable, whether it's on the left, on the right, whatever. It's always in the middle that elections, as you know better than I do, are decided. So I think that, Biden would not have run. He sort of said it at a meant to be a closed-door fundraiser. I wouldn't have probably run a second time if it hadn't been for Trump. But because he is actually the only person who's ever beaten Trump, I think there's a lot of pressure on him.
Yeah, he kind of feels as if he's the Trump killer, isn't he? He's beaten them once or twice.
Yeah, we'll see.
Ooh, I like that. That was a revelatory comment.
What?
Yeah,
no, because I was wrong the last time. Not in 2020. I believe Biden would win in 2016. I was wrong. Yeah. I was wrong on Brexit. I was wrong on Trump. So I'm a little bit cautious. But looking at the polls, which I don't swear by, but looking at enough independents and others, women, for instance, etc., I think it's not a slam dunk, for sure, for Trump. Yeah. But clearly the West is doing a lot of Trump-proofing. They're trying to figure out, how do we save NATO? How do we make sure that, Article 5, if one of us is in trouble, what if the US doesn't come and support us?
Is it binding? Is it not binding?
We got to figure out what to do. So there's that amount going on. Macron has thrown down a massive gamble. Massive. I don't know whether it's going to work. Macron gambled in 2017 that he would create a centrist reality, that he would just create it out of whole cloth, so that he didn't go like America or Britain did in 2016, and he won that gamble. He won again in 2022, the last elections. But now, the environment, and I was quite troubled because I read it was probably the Financial Times or whatever, there's a big read today on the far right. Also the press, unfortunately, and I'm a part of the press, and I take this responsibility very seriously. People start talking about these parties as if they are legitimate, they normalize them.
Yeah.
And so it's suddenly not such a big deal to vote for Marine Le Pen, I noticed that already language is being played with. In some newspapers, they're calling them the hard right instead of the far right. The same people who were the far right last week are now, for some reason, the hard right. I don't know which is worse, but I don't know what they're doing.
Right before we're finished.
Yes. I don't know what's going on.
Absolutely.
But language is very, very important. And so, I think, and I promise you, D-Day really concentrated my mind. There was no way the West was going to win without the sacrifice of these people and without fighting an uphill battle. And it was an uphill battle in every shape and form. And they did it. And we have to be up to that example.
Ladies and gentlemen, we could be here all afternoon, into the evening, well into the night. I think we can just give Christiane a huge round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.